Good evening, everybody. My name is Father Falak. I'm a missionary priest in Church of the Ascension, and I'm here, as I promised, with a program called Meet Someone Special. And today's someone special is the Lord Bishop of Manchester, the Right Reverend Dr. David Walker. Let's welcome him. Bishop David, welcome to this show.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Bishop, everybody knows you because you are a very key figure in the Diocese of Manchester and in the whole country. Everybody knows you and recognizes you, especially recognize you with your sandals. You are very famous with your sandals. We'll hear the story of your sandals later on. And you don't need any big introduction because you are a legend and everybody knows you. Just for the sake of those who do not know you very well, and it is a good opportunity for them to get to know you as a Bishop of Manchester, as a shepherd of the flock in Manchester Diocese. Just let us know where you were born and brought up.
Okay, well, I was born and brought up in the diocese. I was born in the little town of Mossley, in the parish of St George's Mossley, and baptized at in that church, and that is the church where my ancestors' remains are buried, or their cremated remains were put. So that's my kind of historic family church. And then, as a child, we moved about a mile up the road into the parish of Christchurch, Friesland, and that's where I went to primary school. And we lived there throughout my childhood, and my mother lived there until the early 2000s. Of course, I then went to school in Manchester itself, in the Manchester Grammar School in Rusholme, and from there went on to university. So I was born and brought up entirely within this diocese, and it's really quite a privilege to come back as an older adult to offer something back to the place that gave me my start in life.
Excellent. So you are Mancunian.
Very much so.
Very much so. So, did you study in Manchester in college and university?
No, I think the pattern then was most people went away to university. You didn't go to your local university. I think rather more people do that nowadays. But no, so I went to Cambridge University, to King's College. I won a scholarship to there, and I studied mathematics at both undergraduate and postgraduate level for 5 years, until I felt God was calling me onto something else. So I had the benefit of the wonderful choir and the chapel at King's College, Cambridge, which remain very special places for me.
Excellent. And did you feel the call for ministry when you were studying in the University of Cambridge?
Yes, it was. I'd probably been there about 4 years by then, and begun embarking on postgraduate work, but increasingly felt that God was calling me to pastoral work. I noticed that he seemed to use me to support friends and colleagues who were perhaps going through a difficult time, as many young adults do. I'd become quite a keen member of the church and the chapel community in the college, and initially I had a sense that, well, maybe I could work a few years as a researcher, get my doctorate, do maybe some postdoctoral studies in Cambridge in mathematics, and then think about it when I got to 30, 35, and when I could have trained for a shorter period of time for ordination, but felt God's call was becoming rather more urgent, and that he didn't want to wait until I was 30 or 35. He wanted me to give up my mathematical career at that point and head for full-time ministry if the local diocese would accept me.
Mm-hmm. When were you ordained? What age was that?
I was ordained in 1983. I was 26 years old at the time. Although I was sponsored by the Diocese of Ely, because that's a diocese within which the University of Cambridge comes, I was actually ordained into the Diocese of Sheffield. I made it very clear that I wanted to go back north and go back to a kind of an urban industrial city to serve God there. That's where I felt my calling was, and then Bishop of Ely was very clear that the kind of the most likely he would be able to find me a place was if I felt called to rural ministry, and that wasn't the case at all. I wanted the northern industrial city, and I deliberately chose not to come back to Manchester then, because Sue and I had only been married for about 3 years, and I kind of felt if we came back here, it would be my home, and she would always be the plus one, the extra, the outsider. So Sheffield was a city both of us knew a little bit, and we thought that there we would make a home and make friends, and both be newcomers together, which proved to be the case.
Wow, excellent. And did you serve your curacy in Ely diocese or?
No, in Sheffield. So I served all my parish ministry within Sheffield diocese. I had 3 years as a curate, 5 years as a team vicar, and then I was a vicar of my own parish after that for another 9 years until I was called to be a bishop.
Excellent. Just let us know, what was your interest in industrial chaplaincy? Why did you choose? Because very rare people choose the industrial chaplaincy. We heard about prison chaplaincy, we heard about airport chaplaincies, but very rarely people are involved with industrial chaplaincy. So what was that?
Yeah. I always thought that what people do outside of their, with their lives outside of their sort of going to church really matters to God and really matters to their faith. And always felt that faith is a whole life thing, not just a compartment of our lives. That was at the heart of my own calling, why I felt I should, I must commit to full-time ministry. And as an ordinand, when I've been training, I'd visited actually Sheffield as a guest of the industrial mission team for a summer placement, and I was so struck with the work, getting alongside people in their daily labours, in coal mines, in steel factories, and in other parts of industry and commerce. I really felt that I wanted to offer something to that, and they'd obviously like me. So when 3 years later I was coming to the end of my curacy, I was approached by the Archdeacon and asked would I be interested in a job that was half-time ordinary parish work and half-time being the industrial chaplain in the town where my parish would be. And so that was really something I jumped at. I was very influenced by a man called Ted Wickham, who some of the older viewers here may recall as Bishop of Middleton for many years, and of course the Wickham Library in the cathedral is named after him and contains some of his books. And he was the pioneer of industrial mission in Sheffield in the years after the Second World War, when he had positive experiences of ministry in the trenches with the troops, and felt the same ought to apply in a coal mine or a steel mill that applied on the battlefront. And so he was the pioneer of industrial mission in the United Kingdom. And of course, then he moved, eventually after some years leading that team in Sheffield, he moved to Bishop of Middleton. And I'm a great admirer of Ted Wickham, whose writings are still worth reading even all those years later.
Wow. That's excellent. Excellent. And you've been consecrated as a Bishop of Dudley. How did you feel? When were you invited to be a bishop?
Yeah, things are much less sort of organized, even though in those days than they are today. And so I knew that I was kind of being considered for more senior posts, and had been shortlisted for one post as an archdeacon, as it happened, and which made me realize I probably wasn't called to be an archdeacon. I don't have the head for detail that archdeacons need. And then we've been away for a week, actually staying at a Christian holiday centre in Devon, in Lee Abbey, and we got back on the Friday night, and Saturday morning the phone rang, and it was the then Bishop of Worcester, a man called Peter Selby, and he rang to say he'd been trying to get hold of me all week because my name had been suggested as the next Bishop of Dudley, which was the suffragan post in his diocese, and could we meet up and have a conversation about it? And so we met. We had afternoon tea, the two of us, in a hotel in Liverpool, as it happened. After which he invited me to meet his archdeacons and then to come back to see him, where he said he would nominate me to the post. And so it was there were no sort of short lists and competitive interviews for bishoprics in those days. It was much more informal, but he felt we would work together as a team, which we did. And so I served as his suffragan for 7 years or so. Then he retired, and then the next bishop came along. I looked after the diocese and the vacancy. The next Bishop of Worcester came along, and I served with him while he settled in. And then I was invited to apply for the post at Manchester. By then, the system had changed, and so you were interviewed, and I was one of, I think, probably 4 candidates who were interviewed to come here. But I thoroughly enjoyed Dudley. It was another industrial town in the Midlands, if not the north, and another former steel town, and so I felt at home there.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel coming home in Manchester in 2013?
Well, it was the most extraordinary privilege. If I'd had to pick a diocese with the bishop of, it would be Manchester, because who wouldn't want to serve their home diocese? Mm-hmm. And so it felt a great privilege. It felt like it was a place that I kind of understood. I knew I'd physically lived away for a long time, and of course all my family were here. My brother and his family. My mother had died not long before, but she'd always lived in Manchester, and so we'd always come, and we stayed with her when the children were little. So it was a city that I still felt I knew and had a strong affiliation to. So the chance to come back and be its bishop was wonderful.
Excellent. Bishop, you were recently appointed in the House of the Lords.
Mm-hmm.
And because your previous ancestor was Bishop Nigel was Lord Bishop of Manchester. Mm-hmm. So just let the audience know what is the procedure to be the Lord Bishop.
Yeah. Okay. Well, historically, we go back to medieval times, and indeed up until about the early part of the 19th century, all diocesan bishops sat ex officio in the House of Lords. There's an Act of Parliament in 1847, which is actually called the Bishopric of Manchester Act, because it was the Act of Parliament that set up the Diocese of Manchester, but it determined that from then on, the number will be capped at 26. I think they could see there'd be lots of new dioceses created in industrial cities, and I think the Prime Minister of the day was concerned about having more and more bishops in the House of Lords. So we might have become an even more influential lobby than we are at present, and so he was quite keen to kind of cap the numbers. And so the Bishopric of Manchester Act of 1847 caps the number of bishops who serve at 26. A slightly later Act of Parliament says how those 26 are set out, and mostly it's who has served as a diocesan bishop for the longest. So when the previous Bishop of Chelmsford was translated to become Archbishop of York, he vacated one of those seats, and I was the next in the queue, and so I took my seat in September. Yes. Unusually, of course, because that was during the COVID restrictions. While I had to turn up in person to make my oath, I've not actually physically been in the chamber since, but we have special rules at the moment whereby we participate mostly over Zoom or over Teams. We use different virtual conferencing platforms in order to contribute to the life of the House of Lords. So I've not been physically back on the parliamentary estate since the day of my introduction, but I have been an active member of the House.
Excellent. So we are very privileged to have the Lord Bishop of Manchester. And yes, I have heard a few of your debates on the telly as well. So it is excellent. And Bishop, you are involved with the monastic community. On the other hand, you are involved with the Society of Ordained Scientists. And on the other hand, you are involved very much with the social housing. All these are different patterns. So just let us know how you are coping with these three different phases of the community.
Yeah, okay. Well, we deal with social housing first. I mean, I've been involved in social housing probably since my undergraduate days. We used to go on a Sunday morning to a hostel for homeless men in Cambridge and help lead an act of worship, a non-Eucharistic service of morning prayer for the staff and the residents of the hostel who wished to attend it. It was run by the Church Army, so it had an Anglican foundation, and that was my first experience of working with people, alongside people who were effectively homeless and housed in that sort of specialist accommodation. Then, when I went as team vicar, I discovered that the parish I'd gone to, that a lot of properties that had historically belonged to the coal board, in which the mine workers and their families were housed, were being sold off to private landlords. And I heard some horror stories from some of my parishioners about the companies that were buying up these properties, and I felt I wanted to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And I discovered what there was things called housing associations that could buy and run properties. And so I got involved with the housing association, and then with a housing cooperative that we set up from among the people who lived in some of these properties to effectively, as a corporate group, to buy their own homes. And it was fascinating work, and I got drawn into the social housing movement through that, and have kind of stuck ever since. So I've chaired a range of housing charities nationally and locally, a number of housing associations, first in the Sheffield, South Yorkshire area, then in the Midlands, and now back in Manchester, where I chair the housing association that covers the Wythenshawe estate, the former council houses on Wythenshawe. Yeah, I've always had that interest. I think having good housing makes a real difference to the quality of people's lives, and I want to do my bit to make that a possibility for folk. So that's the kind of social housing, and I've written theology around social housing over the years, and to try to understand the nature of where people belong to the place where they live, and that's helped to keep me interested. So that's the housing. The Society of Ordained Scientists, I was approached. They simply wrote to me out of the blue. Their previous visitor, it was Bishop Rupert Hoare, who had been my predecessor as Bishop of Dudley, then went on to be Dean of Liverpool, and of course is now an assistant bishop in retirement here in Manchester Diocese, that he suggested me as his successor. And they wanted somebody who understood science and understood the nature of communities, and they are fashioned along the lines of a religious community. So they wanted me to bring that knowledge to them, which I've done for a number of years now, since about 2010, 2011. The duties are not onerous, but I support and promote the work that the Society does in bringing faith and science together, and recognizing that they're not at odds with each other, and that a great scientist can be a great person of faith. And one of my inspirations as a young man, a member of the same university department in Cambridge that I was a member of, and Professor John Polkinghorne, who then, at the same time as I left to be ordained, as a young researcher, he left as the Professor of Particle Physics to be ordained. And he died sadly just very recently, but he was one of the founders of the Society of Ordained Scientists. And I say somebody who was a great influence on me as a young man before either of us had become ordained, when we were both just Christians and mathematicians working in Cambridge.
Wow.
And then, yeah, monastic communities. Well, that will link onto the sandals in a few moments, but I'm a Franciscan. St. Francis set up three orders in his lifetime. He set up the first order, which then was all men, but now is men and women, who were itinerant friars who moved around preaching the gospel and caring for the needy. And we have them in the Church of England today. He set up the second order, the community of St. Clare, who were enclosed nuns, because back 800 years ago, women weren't allowed to go around preaching and doing good works in public. The only way you could be religious as a woman was to become an enclosed nun. And then he set up a third order, which was for people who had responsibilities in society, in the church or in secular life, who weren't called to give those up because they were doing work for God in that, but were called to live under vows and promises within an obedience to God, following the example of St. Francis as we follow Jesus. Yeah. And so next year, I think it is that the third order has its 800th birthday, and I hope we'll be able to have some sort of celebrations for that. We'll be 800 years old as an order, and it was revived in the Church of England in the early part of the 20th century, when most of the Franciscan orders were revived. But it's much older than that in practice. So that got me interested in monastic communities because I was part of one, and so through that, when there was a vacancy for a bishop on the committee for religious communities of the Church of England, I volunteered in about 2003. And when the previous chair, Bishop Jack Nichols, now also an honorary assistant bishop in retirement here in Manchester Diocese, when he retired as a bishop of Sheffield, I was asked by the archbishops would I be his successor. So I've held that role ever since. But I've actually, today's my last day in it. I had the handover meeting to my successor this morning, and he formally takes over the roles on tomorrow. And I've wished him all the best in that. I thoroughly enjoyed doing it, but there does come a time when it's time to move on and let somebody else take on the reins, and that time has come with that particular work now. But I'll still be a Franciscan, still be interested in religious communities in the Church of England and the wider Anglican Communion.
Excellent. Bishop, I still remember your sermon when you preached about your sandal and the different remedies of oils to keep your feet healthy. And I still remember. And even the rumor is that you went to meet Her Majesty the Queen and still wearing the sandals. Just tell us the story of sandals.
Well, that's the story. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I have worn the sandals for meetings with Prince Charles, but the Queen is of an older generation, and for Her Majesty, I do actually put my shoes and socks on. I always say that there are only two people who ever got my shoes and socks. One was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who ordained me bishop, George Carey, and the other is Her Majesty the Queen. Everybody else has to cope with me in my sandals, even in the House of Lords, and they seem quite relaxed about that. But I know there are still, it was a little bit radical when I was a young man, but probably less so nowadays. We're more relaxed about how people dress, and that we let them dress in ways that are important to them. And for me, I said it is a symbol of my Franciscan belonging. Franciscans don't have to, in my order, don't have to wear sandals, but it reminds me each day that I follow Jesus, but I follow after the example of St. Francis, and the sandals remind me of that, and remind me, particularly when I'm in quite exalted company sometimes, that I am a humble Franciscan, a humble follower of Jesus. But yeah, the Queen is a special case. I grant her that.
Thank you for clarifying, Bishop. Bishop, you wrote a wonderful book, God's Belongers. Can you just tell us about this book and what is the background of this title?
Well, the background of that, the background is that back in 2005, when I was Bishop of Dudley, it became my time to take a sabbatical. My colleague, the Bishop of Worcester, who himself had a doctorate, was very keen that his staff and senior colleagues took sabbaticals. I'd never taken one as a parish priest, and he said, no, you've got to have a sabbatical. So I said I'd have a sabbatical, and I wanted to really think about how Christians belong. That came, as I said earlier, out of my interest in housing. I want to think, how do we as Christians, particularly as Anglican Christians, how do we belong with Christ through the church? And so I set up on a series of kind of studies during that sabbatical, and wrote a couple of articles that were eventually published in professional journals. And I enjoyed in that so much that I carried on with my academic supervisor, Professor Leslie Francis, who's now one of our honorary distinguished canons at Manchester Cathedral. I carried on after sabbatical, writing maybe a couple of academic papers a year, continuing to explore the nature of belonging. And I began to use some of my mathematics. I used statistical models and analysed surveys that I got people to undertake to probe really the way that people belong to God, and what the church can do to get in the way and or to help. Well, that's why the book's called God's Belongers. It's about how we belong with God. Eventually that series of academic papers became the basis of my PhD. And the PhD contains some overarching narrative that brings all the papers together. and having completed the PhD and been awarded my doctorate, I thought there was still something that might be done with that. And I was actually giving a talk in university in the United States of America, and I probably tweeted something about it because I like using Twitter as a form of communication, and I tweeted something about it which one of the staff at the Church Times got hold of and said, "Oh, would you like to write a short piece about this for the Church Times?" So I wrote a little piece for the Church Times, and then an editor from Bible Readers Fellowship, I think, got hold of me and said, "Oh, I've read about this interesting stuff that you wrote in the Church Times. Is there a book in there?" And so she and I met for a coffee in Wales, where she was based at the time, and we agreed there probably was a book in there, and I would go away and write it. And so I took out all of the heavy statistical tables that were the kind of intellectual apparatus of the PhD, and kind of added lots of funny stories and anecdotes to make a book that I hoped would be readable by an interested Christian who wanted to think about how we belong with God through Jesus Christ, and how the church helps us or hinders us in that. And it would be a practical book that particularly clergy, church wardens, and others might pick up, and it'd have some practical advice. Here's some good ideas, things that might work for people who belong in this way or in that way. Because I wanted this to be something, not just an intellectual exercise for a bishop who couldn't think what to do with his spare time, but to be something that actually was a benefit to the people I was serving as a bishop. And so the book came out about 4 or 5 years ago, not long after I come to Manchester. I think I'd substantially written it in my first couple of years here, and I simply offer it to the church for what use it may be. But it's meant to be practical. It's meant to be readable.
Yes.
It's meant to offer people some hints and clues as to kind of how to understand how their congregations behave, and therefore how they might help those congregations to belong to God.
Excellent. And that shows us, Bishop, that these marginalized people are very close to your heart. And before I took this post in Church of the Ascension, I learned about you, how you were involved in Church of the Ascension, how you were very close to people in Lower Broughton. And when this church was burned down, you were there. When they started this project, you were there. And when we just finished our phase 1 on 10th of December, even you supported and you wrote something about the Church of the Ascension. And thank you very much for that. Can you just give us the message of hope to the people of the Ascension and to the people, because it's Easter coming, and this is a good opportunity for us to hear the Easter message from our bishop.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Well, Easter is of course the celebration of Jesus's resurrection. Jesus rose from the dead. It was quite unexpected. People were surprised. I bet some were alarmed. Some of his disciples were confused for a while until they really got to believe it was him. And so I think my message to Ascension is to see the parallels between that and your own story. To see this time of since the fire in the church as being almost like the time Jesus spent in the tomb, and that you are going to rise from the ashes, as it says on your symbol, and that is a resurrection. But the thing about the resurrection always to remember is that Jesus is identifiably Jesus, but there's something different as well. The resurrection body is not quite the same as the earthly body. Yes, the wounds are there in his hands, in his feet, in his side, and yes, he's able. In one of the Gospels, they give him something to eat, and he proves that he's not a ghost. But it's very clear, and St. Paul makes it clear, our resurrection bodies are not just the same as our earthly bodies. It's not going back to what it was before. So although we're very fortunate with Church of the Ascension that it didn't burn completely to the ground, so there is the shell of the building to rebuild around, that basic shape will remain the same. But there will be things that are different. You weren't there back before the fire, Father, and so you'll be part of the newness.
Yes.
And there'll be people coming along new too. We know that it's in an area where there's going to be more building of new houses. When I last stood there, I could see a building site opposite. So it'll be how can this Church of the Ascension serve the new community, not simply honour the old community. And I've always enjoyed my visits to Church of the Ascension, from when I first came to the diocese, and I'm looking very much forward to being back in it again to share with you in the joy of a church that is an Easter church. It's a church that knows what it's like to be burnt to death, if not crucified, and then to be raised from the dead by God. But it's God who raises us from the dead. The builders help, the architects help. We play our part, but it's God who enables that resurrection to take place. So be a risen church and begin to think about what that risen life for you might be like. What will be the same, or what will be different from the church you were before.
Excellent. Bishop, thank you very much for this wonderful time we spent together. And so many people around the globe, they are going to listen and watch this interview later on. And thank you very much for joining us. And
Thank you.
yes. So thank you very much, audience. Goodbye. I'll see you again next Wednesday, hopefully. Until that, stay safe wherever you are.